What I will try to do with you today is to talk about early Arabic novels and specifically about historical novels. And since I also work on Jewish history, I would like to focus in particular about a novel that deals with Jewish history and see how Jewish history was mediated to Arab audiences in this period. Now, in general, when we're talking about early Arab novels and early novels that are serialized in texts, we're talking about a period that is often called the Arabic Nahda, or the revival, which means the revival of Arab culture in the late 19th century, early 20th century. This is a period where you see a print industry growing in the Arab world. This is a period where you see early experiments in Western genres. This is a period where you see renewed interest in dictionaries and encyclopedias. So generally speaking, the sort of height is late 19th century to early 20th century, but we actually start in the mid-19th century. Now, to set the background to this revival, why people are interested all of a sudden in Arab culture, we actually need to go to the capital of the empire that controlled most of the Arab provinces, namely the Ottoman Empire, and to Egypt. So with your permission, I'll start with a few general historical remarks about the context in which these novels were produced, and later on we'll turn to the novels themselves. And so since the mid-19th century, even even in the early 19th century, the Ottoman Empire in Egypt went through a series of reforms and modernization efforts that meant to bring Western technologies, Western models of housing, Western education into the Middle East. And what you have in Middle East, so you can see here, for example, palaces and buildings in Istanbul. And, you know, if I showed you this building and this palace and I said, where is it from? You might not be able to say Istanbul. You might have other connotations or associations. And urban culture is very relevant to print culture. People usually read in cities, in coffee shops, in coffee houses. And one of the interesting phenomena of this period is that you don't necessarily have new modes of communication that replace old modes of communication, new modes of architecture that replaced old modes of architecture. What you have is the old and the new together, side by side, and a series of hybrid models that are inspired by the incredibly rich Islamic cultural heritage and Arab cultural heritage, and new models and new genres like the newspaper, the novel, and so on. And so for many of you, I don't know how many of you have visited cities in the Middle East, but this phenomenon that you have the old city and the new city and that they're side by side was something that emerged in the 19th century. And a colleague of mine from NYU, from Columbia University, Timothy Mitchell, kind of writes about this context. So again, just a few images from Egypt. Again, I want you to think, those of you in the audience who are not from Egypt, I want you to think about whether if you saw these particular images and architecture, you know, this building that is built in this kind of corner fashion, a la Paris, these balconies, you know, these are typical of Middle Eastern cities like Cairo, like Alexandria, like Jaffa, like certain sections in Beirut. And they coexist together with the older models. And in each of them, there are coffee shops, printing places where you can buy books and you can hear a newspaper. And all these things would later on feed the rise of the novel and the new print culture. Now, some of the changes that happen in this period have to do with architecture and with new perceptions of time and space. So this is a photo from Beirut, Lebanon. And what I want to turn your attention to is to this institution, the clock tower. So all these clock towers appear in the Middle East during the 19th century. And they're very common. They're in Beirut, they're in Jaffa, they're in Jerusalem, they're in Najaf in Iraq. But these clock towers are not only something that is decorative or celebratory. Some of them were actually built to commemorate the rise to the throne of Abd al-Hamid. But they also do something to the organization of time and space. Your time is not managed by the call of the azan, of the muezzin, by the call for prayer or the mosque. There's a modern clock in the city. People are thinking, are writing about Greenwich time. And this is in conversation with, I mean, this institution is in conversation with other modern institutions that arrive at the time, like the train station, modern factories, and each of them has a time schedule. And actually, if you read these debates about, you know, trains that don't arrive on time and buses, or first, before buses, other modes of transportation, but you see that people complain about the fact that, oh, in France, you know, you can get a train on time, but in Egypt you have to wait so many hours. But the concept behind it is that we need to have this kind of order. We need our time system to be not on a Hijri model, but an Islamic model, but on a Western model. So this is significant. Another important institution that will be very relevant to the rise of the model and of the novel, and especially the historical novel, is the museum, and more broadly the interest in the past of the Middle East. So at the mid-19th century, early 20th century, if you look at the cultural magazines, you see a lot of stories about the pharaohs, the Babylonians, the Hittites, the Sumerians, in Arabic, to educated Arab audiences. You see reports about artifacts that are in museums. You see stories written by Arab intellectuals about how unfortunate it is that their antiques are being taken by Western archaeologists to be shown in other places. And this becomes actually very politicized at the beginning of the 20th century. So this is the very famous Cairo Museum, to give you an example. Another thing that influences the rise of novels, the rise of newspapers, is the change in the educational system in the Middle East. State schools, sponsored either by the Egyptian state or the Ottoman state, are modernized. They introduced Western sciences. But Western missionaries also set up educational institutions. Initially, they're only open to Christians and Jews. During the course of the 20th century, they expand their efforts. But you see, even today, when you visit the Middle East, churches that were built in the 19th century as an effort of various missionary groups. So this is Jaffa. This is the influence of Russian activity in the Middle East, the Onion Church in Jerusalem. But for Arab culture, one of the most important institutions that is created in this period, in 1866, is a university called the Syrian Protestant College, which later on becomes AUB, the American University of Beirut. This is a very old school in the region's history. And if you look at the lists of graduates, those who converted to Protestantism and those who were not, you find amongst them some of the pioneers of this Arab revival system. Now, this is not to say that only products of Christian missionaries were the engines behind this revival movement. On the contrary, they come from various elites. In Egypt, one prominent person is actually somebody who was sent by a religious university, Al-Azhar, to Paris. So they come from all sorts of places. But in terms of writing novels, experimenting in genres, some of the graduates of this institution will play a dominant role. Now, I'm giving you a story about modernization, getting Western models changed in architecture, but these modernization efforts came with a heavy price. And one of them was actually the rise of religious tensions in the region. Especially in the Ottoman Empire, when they transferred from an imperial system that emphasized loyalty to an Islamic state to an Ottoman civic identity that emphasized loyalty to the empire by all its citizens. So the shift from a sort of a more civic identity was also accompanied by tensions. One of these tensions happened in Mount Lebanon in 1860, where many Christians were killed by their Druze neighbors in Lebanon. And a lot of scholars who deal with that say that the particular implementations of the reforms in Lebanon sort of gave birth to the sectarian tensions. However, not always were these efforts associated with sectarian tensions and failure. We often think about the Christians of Lebanon as a group that suffered a great deal from these reforms. But if we look at another example, the Jews of Baghdad, we actually see how this group in Baghdad integrates because of Ottoman reform efforts, because of education system, because of French Jewish educational networks. The person you see here at the photo is called Sassoon Ezekiel, or Sassoon Effendi, and his family. They were diplomats. He was later on the first minister of finance in Iraq. And they're also a product of this Ottoman reform efforts. Before this guy was a minister of finance, he was also a member of the Ottoman parliament. The family was educated in Vienna. And they benefited from these reforms. However, the fact that there were tensions, the fact that there were sectarian tensions, the fact that people thought about their own place in the community was on the minds of writers. And I'd like you to remember this as we proceed. Now, when we talk about westernization, opening up to the West, one other factor that one needs to remember is that colonialism was an immediate danger. It includes the colonization of North Africa during the 19th century by the French, the occupation of Egypt in 1882 by the British, 1798 by the French. It ends then 1882 by the British. We'll get back to it at the end of my talk. The Ottoman Empire is facing Russian pressures. Missionary activity is also connected to colonial power. And so people in the Middle East, especially writers, when they're writing about reform, about modernity, they have to deal with the fact that the West, in their mind, is not only connected to progress, modernity, education, science, technology, and so on, but also to colonialism, also to the fact that the Ottoman Empire and the Egyptian Empire and the Egyptian state generally sunk into debt, and their economic interests are strongly connected to Western interests. Also to growing competition with European companies. So this is the Suez Canal, which obviously made Egypt very important to British colonialism. And so again, changes, political, economic, and social, are very important to the minds of these novelists. Now, the last thing that I wanted to mention as kind of a remark before we move on to the texts themselves is that the 19th century and the early 20th century are characterized by all sorts of political experiments. So I've mentioned briefly the fact that they were trying to build a civic identity in the Ottoman Empire, but there are other issues. There's a parliament that is opened up in the Ottoman Empire in 1877 for a very short period of time, but there is a constitution in the Ottoman Empire in 1876 already. And there is a shift to empires that are based on a constitutional model. Now, this constitutional model doesn't survive a long time because this particular Sultan, Abd al-Hamid, abolishes the constitution and creates another type of a regime that is based more on relationship between Muslims. I'll skip these slides. But the idea that a society should be governed by a constitution, that liberty is a very important idea, that constitutionalism, elections, and democratic debates are the things that create societies and functioning societies. That's in the press, and that's constant. And you can see it in Egypt in articles by Ahmed Lutfi Sayed, and you can see it in Lebanon in articles by Georgi Zaidan. These are just names of important intellectuals. Now, I know that today, when we're thinking about, you know, what's happening all over the Middle East, right? In Egypt, in Syria, in Iraq. Today we talk about other values, right? Stability, prosperity, and so on. But it's quite astonishing when you return to sort of, again, the pioneers of Arab culture, and you see how deeply they cared about constitutionalism, minority rights, civil rights. I think it's quite astonishing, but also I think that my astonishment is more a product of my political upbringing than theirs. Now, all these changes, again, politics, culture, how to deal with the West, are being sort of transformed and mediated and discussed in what we call a print culture of this period. The 19th century, we have, for the first time, printing house, not for the first time, but on a mass scale, printing houses in such places as Cairo, Beirut, Istanbul, and elsewhere in the Middle East. The most important venue to convey these ideas about constitutionalism, democracy, rights is the newspaper. And what you now, in the first newspapers were published by the governments, and they're extremely boring. If you ever have the chance to read, if somebody would translate to you, the first Egyptian newspaper, Al-Waqai Al-Misriya, it is extremely boring. You know, this governor of that province did that and this. It's not very interesting, to my opinion. But pretty soon, the products become more and more interesting. And perhaps the most interesting one is Abu Nazara, an Egyptian newspaper edited by an Egyptian Jew called Yaqub Sanour, who actually very much supported pan-Islamic ideology, the unity of all Muslims. And interestingly, although Sanour was a very educated man, he studied in Italy, later on lived in Paris, he was exiled by his own government actually, the newspaper was written in the dialect, in Amiya, in the Egyptian colloquial dialect, and also had a lot of cartoons. So you see here a map, and you see here Egypt, this lady here. England here is standing, Russia and French are there, and Egypt is basically saying enough. And the idea behind it is, that was very much relevant in Sanour's article, was to say enough with sort of subjugating British interests to British colonial interests. We need to guard our independence. This is another article from the same newspaper when it was published in France already, Qatl Ummah, the killing of a nation. And the slide here is not very clear, but you basically see, again, the poor Egyptian nation being abused by locals and foreigners. Now, a colleague of mine, Bas Baron, wrote about this trope of, that started in Abu Nazara about representing Egypt as a woman and kind of mediating to the readers of the press that the nation could be a woman. This is a much later depiction, but you see here the British soldier and the Egyptian woman / nation being sort of petrified by this soldier. But the newspapers were not just vehicles to thinking about colonialism and modernity. They were also a vehicle to think about science, industry, progress. This is perhaps the most important cultural and literary magazine that is published in the Arab world. Its name is Al-Muqtataf, and it's published initially in Syria and Lebanon in 1876, and then it shifts to Egypt. Now, in general, a lot of the Egyptian cultural scene is being revitalized in the late 19th century, early 20th century, where a lot of Syrian Christians come to Syria, come from Syria and Lebanon to Egypt. And so Al-Muqtataf begins being published in Beirut, and then it moves to Egypt. Now, when I say Syria this time, it also includes parts of Lebanon, so here's the confusion. These journals, like Al-Muqtataf, first serialized novels. Now, if we did this talk 10 years ago, there would be a very clean line, and I would say the first Egyptian novel was the first Arabic novel, and it was written by a guy called Muhammad Hussein Haikal, and its name was Zainab, and we can see that all the features of the modern novel appear there. I will not do that. What we see since the 80s is all sorts of experiments in genres, in novelistic genres. Some of these novels, the more boring one actually, are educational. So they tell you a story, and it's very clear that there's a message behind it. And they're very didactic, and the narrator would tell the readers, you know, dear reader, and here you should be thinking about this and that. And it's actually not that uncommon. The same phenomena also happen in Europe. Some of them were entertainment novels. Again, they appeared in the press, they appeared in, you can buy them in the markets, and they were, you know, love stories, a little bit like soap operas that we have today. And they were mostly about foreign countries. So there is one novel, for example, called Al-Yahudiya Al-Ajiba aw Fatat Bani Israel, the amazing Jew or the daughter of Israel. And it's about an amazing Jewess. There are novels called The Falah and His Three Daughters, which are about the Falah and his three daughters. And it's very interesting to study these texts precisely because they were not considered, you know, proper novels. They were not like the great masterminds of the 1920s and 30s, names like Taha Hussein or Tawfiq al-Hakim. These are mostly Syrian Christians who write a little bit. Some of them are translations. Alexander Dumas is being translated. Other Western novels are being translated. These translations are kind of so-so. Sometimes they appear as a text. Sometimes, you know, the first adaptation of Les Miserables is actually in rhymed prose. So sometimes they, you know, don't always follow suit. And perhaps the most popular genre is the historical novel. So a novel that is based on a historical event and kind of along the lines of Walter Scott. The conquest of Al-Andalus, the fall of Muslim Spain, and so on. And the man who does this, the man who popularizes this genre, is a man called Georgi Zaidan, born in the mid-19th century in Lebanon, later on moves to Egypt. And Georgi Zaidan edits a journal called Al-Hilal. He's also a historian himself. And he begins publishing a series of historical novels. His first novel is called Jihad al-Muhibbin, The Battle of the Lovers. This is not historical. But after that, he starts publishing a series of historical novels that become immensely popular. They're first serialized in his newspaper, and later on they appear in a publishing house which he also owns. And most of them had the title with ladies, the word ladies or women or something like that in the title. So this is Fatat Ghassan, about the pre-Islamic period, the maidens of Ghassan. These are the maidens of Karbala, about the early debates about the early Shia community. Now, by the way, these posters here are very nice. They're not 19th century. This is sort of produced by in Egypt much later. And as you read these novels, you see the same tropes. Good guys, bad guys, two lovers trying to unite, and then there is something that stops them. And that's why they were very popular. But each and every one of these novels was a political allegory. So this one, Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, named after a very sort of evil medieval governor, actually has to do with the principle of governance. What is good governance? What is bad governance? And this image of the tyrant, the dictator, that oppresses his people, and later on how this oppression leads to rebellion, how this oppression destroys every facet of society, is not just in Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf. It's in almost every novel. And so, for example, in Al-Abasa Ukht al-Rashid, Abasa, sister of al-Rashid, a novel set in the Abbasid period, 9th century, Harun al-Rashid, the great Islamic caliph, is portrayed as a modern-day autocrat. He stifles modes of resistance, and significantly, he suppresses women. And that's another interesting feature of these novels. Al-Abasa, this one is about Shajarat al-Dur, about the first queen in Islam, so to speak. When you read what his female protagonists are saying, that they want education, that they want to end seclusion, that they object to slavery, this is not very historical, although it was written by a historian who used a lot of medieval chronicles to write his books. But actually, in these novels, the women speak a different language. And this language, again, mirrors things that were published in the Egyptian, Syrian, and Lebanese press by people like Qasim Amin, if you heard the name, about the need to end seclusion, the need to allow for female education. But again, they're planted in this kind of love stories that happen in faraway places. So he's, God forbid, he's not writing about the Ottomans, he's not writing about the Egyptians, he's writing something about Harun al-Rashid. But the message behind it is that he's writing something significant about society. Fadhel Andaluz, another example, is a novel about the Muslim conquest of Al-Andalus. The key feature in this novel is the oppression of religious minorities in Al-Andalus before the Muslim conquest. How Jews were oppressed, how the oppression of Jews led Jews support the Muslims, and then when the Muslims are coming, how a just rule is being established, because minorities can flourish. Now, these are all modern construction. Zaidan himself was a Christian, but when he's writing about Jews in Al-Andalus, he's not necessarily thinking about the Jews of Muslim Spain, but he's thinking about religious minorities elsewhere in the Middle East. To give you an example of how a historical novel brings to the fore or uses historical debates that are very relevant to people in the Middle East, I'd like to turn now to the novel that I started with, and that is The New Jerusalem. Yeah, the mic is still with me. And I'll just give a few words of background about the writer, and then we'll turn to the novel itself. So the writer of the novel is a man called Farah Hantoun, a man born in 1874 in Tripoli. And then he's forced to leave school at the age of 16. So he's not these kinds of people who graduated from the Syrian Protestant college and were doctors and scientists. He's different. He's autodidact. He migrates to Egypt. He works for a newspaper that is called Al-Ahram, who's also published by, at that time, the Taqla brothers, two migrants from Bilad al-Sham, from Syria and Lebanon. And he finds his own newspaper, Al-Jami'a, in Alexandria in 1899. Now, for those of you who are interested in Farah Hantoun, we have all the volumes of Al-Jami'a in the Regenstein Library. You can come, you can read, it's available. Nobody checks it out. Believe me, I had it for a long time. Now, later historians called Farah Hantoun a member of a group called the Syrian secularists, quote unquote. So these were journalists and novelists who were committed to the idea of citizenship based not on religion, but rather on social justice and social equality. Some of them were even what we would call today proto-socialists. Now, in later historical sort of intellectual history of the region, he is actually position is very secular because he wrote a book about an Islamic philosopher called Ibn Rushd and sort of presented him as the most important Arab philosopher. And then a very important Muslim reformer, Muhammad Abdu, criticized Farah Hantoun and said, this guy doesn't have the background to understand what Ibn Rushd was. He was not trained in Islamic studies. He misunderstands, he misrepresents. So in later memory, there's sort of this idea of Farah Hantoun as a very secular Christian. But if you read his works very carefully, you actually see, this is, by the way, a copy of this book, you actually see that he was for the harmonization between science and knowledge, that he supported Pan-Islam and Sultan Abdul Hamid as a remedy for colonialism. So while for other people, Sultan Abdul Hamid was this guy, you know, kind of a butcher, Farah Hantoun, who was a Christian, basically said, you know what, Egyptians should work with this guy. And Christians should work with this guy too, because he can help us fight colonialism. His novel, The New Jerusalem, Urshalim al-Jadida, is published in 1904. And it takes place during the Arab conquest of Jerusalem in the 7th century. If you read it, it's so cheesy, so soap opera-like. So it's quite clear why initially people didn't pay attention to it, although today there's a renewed interest. So it tells the story about Ilya, a devoted Christian, who is disappointed from the politics of the church in Jerusalem, and he establishes a farm called the New Jerusalem. And there's interesting parallels between Ilya and Jesus all throughout the novel. The author also read a book called The Life of Jesus by Renan, which was very influential in his thinking. He also translated parts of it. So Ilya falls in love with Esther. Who is Esther? She's a Jewish woman who comes to Jerusalem from Alexandria with her father because they believe that a new political order is about to emerge in the region. And her father and her keep saying, you know, something new is about to happen, something better. And so as the novel proceeds, you have the Jews saying it's a good thing that the Muslims are coming. So you as a reader sort of anticipate the arrival of the Muslim conquest as you identify with Esther. Esther and her father are discovered by an angry mob in Bethlehem. They're almost lynched. And then Ilya helps Esther and her father escape. He hides her in a nunnery. Then they travel around sort of Palestine. He falls in love with her. They have a long conversations about Judaism and Christianity, much more than any potential lovers would do, I think. But the interesting thing is that at one point, because of certain intrigues, I won't get into the plot, Esther disappears, and Ilya really tries to find her. His searches lead him to the Muslim camp, and he is so impressed by the Muslim armies and their ideas of social equality and the equality that they give Christians and Jews that at one point he even becomes a Muslim. Now the novel ends in great tragedy. Esther dies because of her travels. Ilya dies a short time afterwards from a broken heart. But on the other hand, the novel ends in a happy note because a particular set of regulations that have to do with Jews and Christians in the Ottoman Empire and are attributed to a caliph called Umar ibn al-Khattab. So this particular document is celebrated as the great moment of equality given to minorities. Now, historically, there are many, many misrepresentations here, but it is extremely important for Farah Hantoun to emphasize this. Now, let's read a few parts from the novel. The opening scene is about a lynch. Esther and her father arrive to Bethlehem, and somebody tries to butcher them. So why start with the lynch? Here is a quote from the crowd that is desperately looking for Jews. One said, "I saw him, a Jew, passing by from here. He has a beard whose length is like an arm, and his face is yellow like those of the dead." So this is the crowd again, looking for Jews. Another said, "Not only in his beard, but also his height. His head is very small, like a pomegranate, A third one said, no, no, I did not see someone like that, but observed someone short, shorter than a feet. So we're talking about very, very miniature Jews. His beard, in fact, touches the ground because of his short height. Ilya laughed to himself, amused by these conflicting narratives. Now, of course, what he's trying to show here when he's writing about anti-Semitism and mob mentality, which was something that was very important to Egyptian intellectuals at the time and Arab intellectuals, is that anti-Semitism, persecution of foreigners, of religious ethnicities, is not about religion. These guys don't know anything about Jews, but it's about finding another, identifying it, and kind of playing to the most basic instincts of the mob. And remember, he's a Christian describing Christians. I'll skip Esther, but Esther keeps complaining to Ilya that her people are persecuted, that they're being crucified by the Byzantines. He takes some liberties here. And then Ilya responds to her about this religious violence, and he tells her, imagine a situation in which after some years Jerusalem becomes Jewish again, and the Christian monastery on the Mount of Olives is replaced by a Jewish synagogue, where they would now crucify young Christian women who refuse to betray their faith. What influence would be to the words of the Christians saying that the Jews are barbarians? The Jews would answer by saying, you taught us this barbarism yourself. Now, the way I read it is a very important idea that appears in the historical novels of Georgi Zaidan and in other novels, which is that if you persecute religious minorities, if you persecute more broadly the people in your own country, you create cycles of violence, of revenge and counter-revenge that never end. And here he sort of places it in the words of Ilya talking to his Jewish lover. Now, why Jews? Why to pick a novel about Jews? He's a Christian, he writes to Muslims. But if you actually look at the press of this time, late 19th century, early 20th century, before Zionism becomes a major phenomenon in the Middle East, you see that there's a great interest in Jewish history, modern and ancient. Intellectuals condemned modern anti-Semitism. They report about Jewish struggle for rights. They report about ancient Jewish history. And some of it is done to sort of highlight European hypocrisy. Here are the Europeans preaching to the Muslims how to treat the Christian minorities, where in Europe's own backyard and in Europe's own history, Jews were treated very badly. And this actually fits this narrative that was very popular at the time, that Islamic cultures flourished while Europe was in the darkness of the Middle Ages. So again, all these things are not historically accurate, but these were things that were told at the time. There was an interest in the Dreyfus trial, a trial of a Jewish officer tried wrongly for treason in France, a very anti-Semitic trial. Farah Hantoun writes about it. Rashid Rid, in favor of Dreyfus. Rashid Ridda, a very important Islamic reformer, writes against the persecution of Dreyfus, saying, why is this disease now coming to the Middle East? So there's an interest in this particular global event, and there's a general interest in Semitic cultures. This is a table that appeared in a lot of newspapers about the Semitic family trees, about Semitic languages, Semitic civilizations. Now, this is a time when Europe itself, kind of intellectuals and writers, are writing about the divisions between Aryans and Semites. And this is very interesting to Arabs at the time, and they're trying to figure out where are they standing on this racial scale in Europe. Now, by talking about Semitic civilizations, they also talk about the Middle East contribution to global civilization. This is not just about the Semites, but in general, you see a lot in the Levant about how the Babylonians and the Phoenicians and the Assyrians sort of gave the world its first writing systems, its first legal systems. And in Egypt, it's paralleled by writing about non-Semites, about the sort of Pharaonic kingdom. But when they're writing about the Semites and where they're writing about the Semitic family tree, then they also write about where Hebrew sort of fits in connection with Arabic. And actually, Georgi Zaidan, in his book about the history of the Arabic language, writes about sort of words and practices that are common to Jews and Muslims, and words like kohen in Hebrew and kahen in Arabic that comes from sort of the same conceptual world, in his opinion. The interest in Hebrew in general is also originating from a project that was sort of important to people in the surroundings where Farah Hantoun was born and raised, and this is the translation of the Bible into Arabic. In general, there was I won't get into the details on the slide, but in general, there was a Protestant translation done with local Arabs. There was later on a Jesuit translation. It's all happening in Beirut. It's basically Christian missionaries, especially Protestants, who say, you know, this text that we have, it can't speak to modern Arabs, so we need to produce new translations. The Protestants go for more simplified Arabic. The Catholics go to a more to an Arabic that is closer to the classical idiom. But they face challenges, theological challenges, but also linguistic challenges. When you use words, do you use words that sort of mimic the Hebrew vocabulary or sound like Hebrew roots? So for example, for books, would you use asfar, that is similar to sfarim, the Hebrew word, or would you use kutub, which is a more common name? How would you translate the name Elohim? Allah? Now Elohim in Hebrew is already a plural form. Where did this plural form come from? And people write about these issues. And a scholar by Sasson Somech actually showed that the Jesuits were making use of the Jewish medieval translation of the Bible into Arabic in the Middle Ages. And so again, for somebody like Farah Hantoun, he was very interested, obviously, in democracy and minority rights, but he knew about Jews because this was in his culture. I'll skip this, but I'll end with a comment that Muslims at the time, Arabs at the time, also knew that Jews in Europe were interested in the history of Islam. And again, before Zionism, there were, and also even during the rise of the Zionist movement, there were Jews in Europe who felt very strongly about the situation of Muslims. Especially Egens Goldziher, who is an Hungarian Jew. He's one of the founders of modern Islamic studies. There's a whole travel narrative of his trips to the Middle East. But one of the most moving descriptions of his diaries and his travels to the Middle East. And again, this is a man who, if you pick any graduate student from my department, Near Eastern Languages and Civilization, you tell him Goldziher, they can tell you exactly his books and his arguments and how they stand today and how do they impact Islamic law. So he's a very important person. At the time, he was also marginalized in his own Hungarian university because of his Judaism, because he was an Orthodox Jew. And he goes to Egypt and he visits Al-Azhar. He talks with the major reformers, and he also goes and prays in the mosque. And this is what he writes: in the midst of thousands of the pious, I rubbed my forehead against the floor of the mosque, because he's praying and he knows exactly how to pray. Never in my life was I more devout, more truly devout, than at that exactly Friday. So again, this is a guy who was an Orthodox Jew. He was a believing Jew. There is a description on how at his very last days before he died, one of his students come to visit him, and he's reading the Bible, but he's also reading a book about Islamic law. And he says to the student, you know, when I'm going up there, I don't know if God will be okay with this. But at this particular moment, when he's in the mosque, when he's in Al-Azhar, he feels the most pious as a Jew. And again, Goldziher, if you look at the obituaries written about Goldziher when he died in 1920 in the Syrian press, they recognized the fact that this man appreciated, the intellectuals, Islamic culture. And I'd like to end with another example of a man that was known at the time, today is completely forgotten, sort of in Arab culture. And this is Simon Wolf, an American consul to Egypt, that was actually present in Egypt during the Urabi revolt, a national revolt that led to the conquest of Egypt by the British. And from his reports to the Americans, we see how critical he is towards the French and the British, and how sympathetic he is to Urabi. And he warns at one point the Egyptians not to how to deal with the British, to whom he refers to as Trojan horses. So, you know, not very sympathetic to them. And this is a speech that he gives about the Urabi revolt as a Jew in Egypt, 1892. As an Israelite, a brother of the Arab branch of human family, so it's thinking again in this kind of closeness between Semites, I fully appreciate all the Egyptians long for. I feel grateful to the Mohammedans for their shelter and protection, for the freedom of my brethren had enjoyed for years in Muslim countries. So again, these ideas of Farah Hantoun, that Islam kind of gave protection to minorities, and all we need to do is kind of revive it anew under a new state, was also echoed from the other side by European Jews who were interested in Islam. Now, there's not a parallel exactly between the Muslims and the Jews, but it's important to note that these discourses were floating from both sides of the Mediterranean. I don't know if Hungary is really the other side of the Mediterranean, but a bit, if you go far enough. But I wanted to end with this quote, because I think that if we sort of think about cultures today, and I've mentioned this at the beginning, on the one hand, you know, Farah Hantoun novel, as I said, in terms of the dialogue, the development of the character, is extremely simplistic. You know, the reader is being told what to think. There are footnotes referring you to Renan. There are footnotes telling you to think about how workers are treated in Britain as you're reading about the Byzantine Empire. So it's a mishmash. But in terms of the ideas that, again, flourished at this period, that minority rights should be respected, that constitutionalism is the best remedy to autocracy, that Islam is a culture with which Christians and Jews could identify, and this kind of reinvention of the Islamic past in this particular novel, but again, all over the print market, is something that is very important and perhaps something that could give us some hope as we look at the Middle East today. So thank you very much. Ritani has a novel called Zaini Barakat, which is about the Mamluk period, so 1250 to 1517. When you read this novel, and many authors commented on that, it reads as a sort of a political allegory on tyranny. And so the ways in which he describes how you know, the state spies after people, send letters and things like that. It has very important parallels to certain Middle Eastern dictatorships. Radwa Ashur, coming from a different direction, and we have here her translator here at the audience, we're very fortunate, writes about also Muslim Spain. And her novel is called Granada, sort of about the expulsion, so to speak, although again it's problematic. And you know, certain people are now trying to compare it to Al-Mansur by Heine and to other texts. But this is a very rich historical novel, a part of a trilogy that only one part is translated into English, and we hope that the other parts will soon be translated by Kay. But this is something different, you know. Yeah. But when she writes about, you know, the end of Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain, she writes about, she thinks about the Palestinians. And that's the sort of what's on her mind. She's also married to a Palestinian. More broadly, like this whole issue, this whole imagination of Muslim Spain as kind of a site where cultures thrived, and Judaism and Christianity and Islam all the kind of live together, that's very common. That's a very common trope. You find it also in poetry of Mahmoud Darwish, for example. So here it's being talked about in historical novels, and then a lot of them, there's actually a scholar by the name of Ben Cobbler in Rutgers who works on contemporary historical novels. The last novel I'll reference is a novel by a very important Lebanese writer called Ilyas Khouri. And it's called Yalo, Y-A-L-O. And this is actually about contemporary Lebanon, but there are references there to the historical novels of Georgi Zaidan and how they kind of framed the very disturbed psyche of the protagonist. And there you sort of had, you know, the Muslim past in the Islamic novels, the early massacres based on sectarian violence in 80-60 Lebanon, and then Lebanon during the Civil War, where the whole system collapses. And so he kind of very sophisticatedly kind of thinks about the past and the present. It's an extremely depressing novel, so I recommend, but, you know, Civil War in Lebanon. Any other questions? Again, please don't take it as historical accounts. These are modern intellectuals connected to nationalist projects that kind of try to, you know, play with the past to fit the goal of the present. But again, I think that one of the things to remember is that you hear a lot of things in the news today about, you know, Islam and democracy and Muslims and democracy and Christians and Muslims cannot live together and Muslims cannot live together, ISIS and all that. But the reinvention of the Islamic past is not necessarily something that a bunch of, you know, very weird radicals and violent ones are doing now in Mosul. This is also something that was actually inspirational and inspired people to think about liberty and democracy and constitutionalism in the beginning of the 20th century, late 19th century.
You have any comment why you think there's such a dearth of, not just the novels, but why just the American university education system in general doesn't teach anything about colonialism, the Middle East, or anything? I mean, given the fact that there's been so much turmoil, I mean, it's just shocking to me.
That there is.
I have a 22 and 24-year-old who actually both went here to school, by the way. But no, I'm just saying in general, on the mainstream, you would think there would be more novels and access and history, so people have a better context of how we got to this point.
Yeah.
And there's just like nothing. So anyway, I thought that was a great lecture.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I guess I warned you out a little. So thank you very much for coming. Enjoy the rest of the day.